Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 59th online webinar produced by the College Music Society. CMS webinars are presented as a benefit of membership for all CMS members who choose to register and attend. Thank you all for being with us today. For this CMS webinar, the CMS Committee on Musicians' Health presents A Musician's Guide to the Brain, What We Need to Know and Why. Our presenter is Dr. Lois Svard, Professor of Music Emerita from Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Dr. Svard will be with us in a few moments. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted for viewing next week, along with previous sessions. Information regarding all CMS webinars may be found at our website and in the monthly electronic newsletter to all society members this month at CMS. Pianist Lois Svard has received critical acclaim for her performances and recordings of contemporary American piano music. She also writes and lectures extensively on the applications of recent neuroscience discoveries for the study and performance of music. Dr. Svard is a professor of music emerita at Bucknell University. She is a member of the CMS Committee on Musicians' Health. It is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Lois Svard. Welcome, Dr. Svard, and please begin.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to present the webinar about music and the brain. But before I start, I'd like to alert everyone to a series of webinars that will be happening this coming fall, presented by the CMS Committee on Musicians' Health. As you may know, several years ago, the National Association of Schools of Music published a series of health advisories urging music schools and departments to integrate musicians' health into the music curriculum. So the fall series of 6 webinars will address the NASM advisories, hearing health, vocal health, musculoskeletal health, mental health, and mindfulness. So please watch. There will be an announcement soon about the dates for those webinars. And also, before continuing, I want to tell you how to access an online handout. I write a blog called The Musician's Brain, where I post about recent discoveries in neuroscience and what those discoveries mean for musicians. If you click on links and scroll down to CMS webinar, you will find an online handout directing you to further resources that have to do with today's talk. You can also access the CMS link, which is from a talk I gave at the CMS conference in Indianapolis last fall, and also general. So musicians are becoming increasingly more comfortable speaking about the mind-body connection, recognizing that our emotions can affect our performance and our physical health. But we don't talk or even think about our brains, about what is actually happening in the brain that makes it possible for us to have a state of mind, to play an instrument, to make sense of different kinds of music that we're listening to perform, or to learn any of the theoretical or historical information in our music classes. We're familiar with terms like neurons, neurotransmitters, synapses, spinal cord, but what do all of these terms about the brain have to do with actually making music? In 1967, a Russian pianist who was living in New York, named George Kochavitsky, published a book called The Art of Piano Playing. Kochavitsky laid out what was known at that time about how the central nervous system functions as we play the piano. And he flatly stated that practicing is about practicing the brain and spinal cord. Needless to say, he was a bit ahead of his time, and not very many people paid attention. Now, while most neuroscientists would say that we're still at the tip of the iceberg in understanding the complexities of the human brain, knowledge of brain function has expanded exponentially over the past 20 years, and neuroimaging techniques such as MRI and PET scans have allowed researchers to look at questions that, in Kochavitsky's time, were subjects only for speculation. So, for example, this fMRI study shows the difference in the brain between improv done on a C major scale, which is the top two rows, and free improv at the bottom. The researchers, Charles Limb and Alan Brown, are at the NIH. Charles Limb also has an appointment at Peabody. And they suggest that these findings may begin to provide a cognitive context for the understanding of creative activity in the brain. There's a link to that study in my online handout, and there's also a link to a marvelous TEDx talk given by Lim. He also studied rappers, and he actually does some rapping in the TEDx talk. Neuroscience and music is a rapidly growing field, and we're really fortunate as musicians that there's been so much interest in studying musicians and the process of making music. Neuroscientists have explored everything from where various elements of music, such as melody and rhythm, are processed in the brain, to more complex issues such as sight reading, memory, improvisation, emotion, and performance anxiety. There is a growing belief that there is a biological basis for music and that we are, in fact, hardwired for music just as we are for language. So all of this information is light years beyond what Kochevitsky had access to 50 years ago. But he was absolutely right about his central premise that practice happens in the brain. And it doesn't matter whether we're practicing the piano, voice, violin, rehearsing in an ensemble, or studying music history or theory. So in the short time we have today, I'm going to talk briefly about just one area of brain research, neuroplasticity, or how the brain changes in response to learning, experience, or injury. Brain plasticity is at the heart of everything we're able to do as musicians. Plasticity is what allows us to learn to play a musical instrument. It allows us to improve our technique and our musical understanding. It allows us to learn new music and new academic subjects, and it allows us to perform with confidence. But neuroplasticity is also at the heart of some kinds of injuries and performance anxieties. And since avoiding anxieties and injuries is an important aspect of musicians' health, I'm going to talk today about how we wire our brains as we learn, which is plasticity, and how understanding that process can help us to learn more securely, to avoid injury, to alleviate some kinds of performance anxiety, and thereby helping us to become healthier musicians. You may have seen images like this of neural pathways in the brain. These are actual nerve fibers. This isn't a drawing, connecting various parts of the brain, photographed with a new kind of imaging technology called diffusion tensor imaging. This particular image is from a BBC story about this mapping technology, and there's a link to the full story on the online handout. These images are from Daniel Levitin's book, This Is Your Brain on Music, which I'm sure many of you have read. The two images show all of the areas of the brain that are involved in making music. The first image shows the various cortices like the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, the sensory cortex, the motor cortex, prefrontal cortex, which is where the thinking happens. And the second image shows specific structures like the amygdala, which processes emotions, and the hippocampus, which processes memory. Now, one of the reasons that neuroscientists like to study musicians is because making music is such a highly complex activity. In order to play a piece of music, we have to pull together information from all of these different brain areas, the sensory areas, motor areas, thinking areas, emotional areas, which results in this vast network of neural pathways that connect virtually all parts of the brain. So let's look at just one pathway in the brain, the auditory motor loop. When we make a sound on our instrument, the sound waves enter the ear, where they're turned into neural impulses in the inner ear, and sent to the auditory cortex for processing, then to the premotor cortex, then to the motor cortex, which turns them into neural impulses that will control our muscles. And those neural impulses are sent down the spine, the nerves in the spinal cord, to the muscles controlling the arms and fingers so that we make more sound. So we have continuous sound movement, sound movement. Now, neuroscientists have found that within 20 minutes of practice for a beginning adult on a keyboard, when they've taught just a simple little 5-finger pattern, connections are already beginning to be formed between the auditory and the motor areas of the brain. This is plasticity. So how are these pathways formed? Neural pathways are made up of chains of single neurons linking one to another. You have an image there, but I also have my very own brain neuron, who is named Ramon. This is what a neuron looks like, and they connect axon end to dendrite end of another neuron. There are 86 billion of these neurons in the brain, and they can combine in an infinite number of ways. So as we've been discussing, when we learn a new piece of music, pathways are connected, are created connecting all of these brain areas that we saw in this slide. And this is an artist's representation of neurons connecting to form neural pathways. The flashes of light you see are the electrical impulses that are traveling down the axon of the neuron. At the axon end, they release neurotransmitters or chemicals which jump across a gap called the synapse to the dendrite end of the next neuron. So basically, all of the beautiful music that we make or listen to is in the brain nothing more than electricity and chemicals, which is a pretty mind-boggling thought. So let's say, as a pianist, I have just read the first prelude by Olivier Messiaen. I sight read it. All of my sensory perceptions of the piece, the visual perceptions of what I see on the page, what it looks like on the keyboard, auditory perceptions, either what I'm hearing in my mind as I look at the score or what I hear on the keyboard, kinesthetic, how it feels. All of these sensory perceptions have entered my brain as patterns. They've formed representations in the brain called memory traces by psychologists or neural pathways by neuroscientists. As we just talked about with the auditory motor loop, the sensory information connects to the motor cortex that processes it, decides what kind of motions I need to play the piece. My brain has taken note of the title, La Colombe, and if I don't know French, I hope I will have looked it up to see that it means the dove. My brain will also have noted dynamic and tempo indications, other details depending on my sight reading ability. All of this information has come together as pathways representing this piece. So the prelude now exists in my brain as a memory trace or a network of neural pathways. It's part of short-term memory. If I decide I don't want to learn it, that memory trace will just disappear. But if I decide I like it and I want to learn and memorize it, I begin to practice. Now, as I'm practicing, I'm reorganizing information, I'm figuring out a fingering, I'm fixing in correct notes and rhythms, practicing motor skills, I'm making connections to maybe other music of Messiaen that I've played or other French music, deciding on an interpretation. But what the brain is doing is biological. It's adding more neurons like this to the pathway as I add more information. It's making the synapses or the connections between one neuron and the next stronger. And it's making the transmission along the neural pathway faster so that I'm able to play more fluidly and with greater speed. Neuroscientists say cells that fire together wire together. The more often one neuron fires to the next in a pathway, the more likely it is that it will continue to do so. It becomes wired. My brain is consolidating the information and transferring it from short-term to long-term memory. And that consolidation is causing, and as the cells that fire together, wire together, is causing the brain to change. Neuroplasticity. There are some kinds of practice and study that do a far better job of transferring to long-term memory than others, whether we're practicing or studying for a test. We don't really have time to talk about those methods today, but you can find several posts on my blog with that information, and you'll be directed to those in the online handout. It's also interesting to know that whether we teach in the classroom, the studio, or the rehearsal room, different teaching methods activate different parts of the brain. In the mid-90s, two researchers in Germany, Eckhard Altenmüller and Wilfried Grun, conducted a study with 7th and 8th graders, 13 to 14 years old, to see if the way in which music was learned had an impact on brain activation. The study involved teaching and learning of antecedent and consequent phrases, which the students hadn't studied previously. Students were divided into 3 groups. A declarative or verbal learner group received very traditional instruction about antecedent and consequent phrases, verbal explanations, visual aids, notation, rules, some musical examples. The second group, the procedural learner group, participated in musical experiences to learn the difference. They sang and played phrases, they improvised with rhythm and pitches, and they performed examples from the repertoire. Third group was a control group and received no instruction. And I should say that the 2 photos you just saw are not from the study. They're just representative photos of declarative and procedural learning. But after learning, it's interesting. The declarative group showed increased activation in the left frontal and temporal brain regions, reflecting inner speech and analytical step-by-step processing. The procedural group, on the other hand, showed increased activation of the right frontal and bilateral, both sides of the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe, which shows a more global way of processing and visual spatial associations. So we know from multiple research studies that the more areas of the brain are involved in learning, the more likely we are to remember. So if different teaching methods activate different parts of the brain, that suggests that the more ways we present the information to the students, thus activating more areas of the brain, the stronger the learning is going to be. So that's a pretty fast, basic version of how we learn. The brain creates pathways representing the music or the academic knowledge. It adds to them, strengthens them. Through practice or study, we transfer the information from short-term to long-term memory. And you can find more info about this on the blog. Without plasticity, making music isn't possible. And plasticity is really wonderful when everything is working correctly. But the brain doesn't self-correct. So we can wire incorrect information or unhealthy information just as easily as not. So we've talked about the fact that as we learn, the brain creates pathways and cells that fire together, wire together. Or as musicians like to say, practice makes perfect. But practice doesn't make perfect, it makes permanent. We all know that when we're initially learning something, we make mistakes, and the brain wires in those mistakes just as it wires correct information, maybe wrong notes, wrong rhythms. And the longer we practice that incorrect information, the stronger the pathway is going to be. When we discover the mistake or decide to change fingering or change interpretation, we have to create a new pathway and make it stronger than the old one so that the new way will become the default. This is not simply a matter of recognizing that something was wrong and deciding to change it. There's an actual biological process in the brain that makes the change permanent, and it doesn't happen just through recognition. All of those synapses connecting neuron to neuron in the old pathway have to disconnect, and they disconnect through not being used. So new ones have to be formed through repeated practice until the new pathway becomes stronger and becomes the default. And I've found that when students understand the process, that it's an actual biological process and not simply a matter that something is wrong with their thinking, not only do they become more careful about learning in the first place, but they also are more patient about what it takes to make lasting changes. We also need to understand that if we don't have an anatomically healthy way of playing, if we practice with tension or stress, that also becomes wired into the brain. And that can lead to injuries such as movement injuries, focal dystonia, repetitive stress injuries. The process for correcting movement injuries is just the same as that for correcting wrong notes or rhythms. The neural pathways corresponding to the unhealthy approach to the instrument have to be disconnected by disuse and new ones created. David Vining is a trombonist who suffered from embouchure dystonia. On his website, he discusses in detail how he overcame embouchure dystonia by retraining himself how to play. Focal dystonia, or involuntary contraction of the muscles, affects a lot of musicians. In keyboard or string players, it affects the hands, fingers. In brass players, dystonia targets muscles in the mouth, face, jaw, or tongue. Vining mentions neuroplasticity only once or twice, but it's basically what he's talking about. It is neuroplasticity, the creation of new neural pathways in the brain, that's at the heart of the retraining and recovery process. So, what about performance anxiety? Musicians suffer from performance anxiety for a variety of reasons: fear of what the audience will think, fear of technique failing, fear of memory loss. And these anxieties also become wired into the brain. We all know that we remember things better when they have a strong emotional component, whether it's memory for music that we love, memory of a particularly bad experience on stage. So why is that the case? It's all due to the limbic system, because the limbic system is involved in both emotion and memory. The two almond-shaped structures, one on either side of the brain, are the amygdala, which is involved in the processing of memory and with emotional reactions. And it seems to be particularly keyed to negative experience. The hippocampus is involved with consolidating short-term memory into long-term memory. And while there are different theories about why emotions affect memory, one is that the amygdala actually is affecting the consolidation process when we're transferring from short-term to long-term memory. Each time we retrieve a memory, the memory's a little bit different. For playing a piece from memory, might be playing it with a slightly different tempo, different interpretation. We may make a memory slip. There may be a particularly wonderful audience response. All of that gets wired into the existing memory. So let's say that we have a memory slip in performance. The negative emotions associated with that memory slip become part of our brain wiring, leading to more anxiety the next time we perform. And performance anxiety can then become self-perpetuating. We all know that if we have a bad experience on stage, we need to override it with positive experiences. There are many different approaches to dealing with performance anxiety, and that's really outside the scope of today's webinar. But the important thing to remember from the standpoint of neuroplasticity is that whatever approach one is choosing to deal with performance anxiety, it involves rewiring the brain. Plasticity has been involved in wiring negative emotions into our performance experience, making us anxious about performance. So plasticity also has to be involved in addressing that. That takes time and the creation of new neural pathways associated with positive experiences. So just a few last-minute thoughts. Plasticity happens most readily when it's linked to positive emotions. We learn best what we like, and this is actually why one of the reasons neuroscientists like to study musicians, because we're doing something we feel so passionately about. The more motivation, the more plasticity, and that this is actually linked to positive emotions. We learn best or recover best from injury when we're highly motivated. But that very strong motivation, which can lead us to overpractice, can also lead to injuries. And my favorite, plasticity occurs throughout life. Neuroscientists used to think that plasticity ended by about the time we were a teenager. They now know conclusively that it continues throughout our lives. Even if we're in our 50s, 60s, 70s, decide we want to adopt a healthier way of playing or want to combat performance anxiety, it's not too late. We can still make those plastic changes. So please feel free to contact me at my Bucknell EDU email or through the Musician's Brain if you have any questions. And on the blog site, please click on links, scroll to CMS webinar to find a handout about today. It's always been a wonderful time to be a musician, but right now it's a particularly fascinating time because so much research is being done on musicians and the process of making music. Research that can help us in the studio, practice room, classroom, the rehearsal space, and the concert stage. Thank you. I think I may have finished with a couple minutes to spare. Tom?
Very good. And thank you very much for your presentation today, Dr. Sfard. Now we do welcome any questions or comments from those online with us today. Any comments or questions from those online?
I have a question.
Please.
This is Kathleen Dowd from Immaculata University. I am curious to see, since I'm very much interested in foreign language and the correlation between foreign language and the study of music, I'm wondering if there has been any literature that you know of or any recent studies on the correlation between your very fine presentation and the development of foreign language.
There are quite a number of studies. Actually, I'm going to suggest that you email me and I can send you some information. I think one very interesting, not a single study, but they are finding that people who grow up speaking a tonal language like Chinese, there's actually a higher incidence of absolute pitch, which is rather interesting. But the connections between music and language are being studied a lot. So I really can't get into all of that right now, but if you email me, I'd be happy to send you some info.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. There is a wonderful book called Music, Language, and the Brain by Ani Patel, P-A-T-E-L. It's a pretty exhaustive study of music and language. So you may want to check that out.
Lois, I just want to, this is Gail Berenson. I want to thank you for your wonderful presentation as always. And I just wonder if you would just take a minute to say something about your track of sessions happening at MTNA that's coming up very shortly.
Oh, I'd love to. For the first time, Music Teachers National Association always, or for the past several years, has had a day called Pedagogy Saturday, which is prior to the beginning of the conference. And for the first time this year, they're doing a music learning theory track, which they asked me to put together. So we have a number of speakers that are going to be talking about various aspects of music learning theory, from are we hardwired to make music, to how do adults learn cognitively that's different from children. How does Generation Z learn? How do musicians learn following injury when they want to relearn motor skills? So a lot of fascinating information. That's April 2nd in San Antonio. You can find more information on the MTNA website.
We have come to the end of our time for today's webinar. And as a CMS member, you are invited to propose topics for future webinars. We also welcome your feedback and your thoughts about this session. Please send us an email message at webinars@music.org. Archive recordings of CMS webinars are accessible both through a link to the CMS webinars page where you went to register for this webinar, and by going to the College Music Symposium internet site. That's symposium.music.org. There you can scroll down to click on CMS Forums and find a link to today's recording. This recording should be posted within 1 week. Our next CMS webinar is scheduled for Friday, April 8th, 4 weeks from today. Doctors Constance Cook-Glenn, Daniel Bishop, Aida Husanova, and Eric Lindsay, all from the Jacobs School of Music at Indiana University in Bloomington, will be joined by Professor Martin McKay from Kentucky State University in Frankfort. Together, they will present a special 1-hour session on new audiences' lasting impact for pathways for general student sustainability. This webinar is an outgrowth of a panel session which took place during the 2015 CMS National Conference in Indianapolis. If you've not already registered and would like to attend the next CMS webinar, please go to our website, www.music.org, and register as you did for today's session. We hope you'll be with us on April 8th. And please be reminded of several regional conferences of the College Music Society taking place soon. The Great Plains and Pacific Southwest chapters have already gathered just this past weekend, and the 5 remaining chapter conferences will meet soon. Please notice the dates and locations of upcoming CMS chapter conferences yet to take place this spring. For complete information, you can go to our website, www.music.org. For now, thank you very much for being with us online today, and special thanks to our presenter, Dr. Lois Svard. I'm Tom Cook for the College Music Society.